The clay is cool in the tub before the room has warmed, and when you lower your fingers into it, the surface gives way with a slow, soft pull, as if the morning itself has settled there overnight and is not yet ready to be stirred. Outside, Danzig is still grey along the river, with damp air moving between the warehouses and the narrow streets, carrying the smell of wet timber, coal smoke, river mud, and the faint sweetness that never quite leaves the walls of a sugar house. You stand near the claying room with your sleeves rolled neatly above the wrist, and the floor beneath your boots is tacky in places. Not dirty exactly, but marked by years of syrup, water, clay, and careful work. Above you, rows of sugar loaves rest in their molds, pale cones still hidden inside earthenware, waiting through the quiet hours while gravity does what hands cannot hurry. In the 1860s, in a Danzig refinery near the busy waters of the Vistula and the Motlowa, the sugar clayers' work began before the city had fully opened its shutters. The bakeries were not yet bright. The clerks were not yet scratching their pens across invoices, and the carts that would later rattle over cobbles were still standing in yards with their shafts lifted like resting arms. But inside the refinery there was already movement, not hurried movement and not loud movement, only the low pattern of a place where heat, sweetness, and waiting had their own order. You know the order because it has entered your body over the years, through repeated mornings and repeated gestures, until the work no longer needs to be explained to you in words. The sugar had been boiled before it reached you, thickened in copper pans and poured while still warm into tall, cone-shaped molds, each one set with its narrow point downward so the darker syrup could drain away. Your part came later, when the loaves had set enough to hold their shape, and when the top of each mold waited for the pale layer of wet clay that would slowly wash through the sugar and draw the last brownness downward. It sounds almost too plain when said quickly, as if the whole trade were only clay, sugar, and time. But nothing in the room feels simple when you stand among the molds in the half-light. Each cone has its own small character, its own level surface, its own dampness, its own way of accepting the white clay and letting the water move through the grains. A careless hand can waste what careful boiling has made, while a patient one can help turn raw sweetness into the hard white loaves that grocers wrap, merchants sell, and households keep for special use. So you begin with the clay, because the clay must be right before anything else can be right, and because the quietest parts of work are often the ones that decide the day. It has been soaked, strained, and kneaded until the grittier bits are gone, and now it lies in the tub as a smooth, pale paste, neither too thin nor too stiff. If it runs too freely, it will sink unevenly through the sugar, and if it is too heavy, it will sit uselessly on top, like a lid instead of a slow white rain. Your wooden paddle moves through it with a rounded sound, a small wet fold, and turn that repeats as steadily as breathing. The clay smells faintly of earth after rain, though inside the refinery that smell mingles with molasses, brick dust, warm boards, and the smoky breath of the furnaces in another part of the building. You lift the paddle and watch the clay fall back in a ribbon, and by the way it breaks and settles, you know whether it needs more water, more stirring, or only another minute of rest. There is no clock in the clay itself, yet it teaches you a kind of time, one measured by thickness, shine, and the feel of weight against the hand. A younger man might want a rule that can be spoken once and remembered forever, but the older hands in the refinery know that sugar has weather inside it. A wet day along the river asks for one kind of attention, a dry, cold morning asks for another, and in winter, the clay can seem to wake slowly, holding the night chill long after the stoves have taken the edge from the air. You carry the first pail to the rows of molds, and the handle presses into the same place on your palm that it pressed yesterday, and the day before, and many mornings before that. The claying room is arranged for work rather than beauty, but at this hour it has a beauty all the same, with its ranks of earthen cones, its shelves, its draining troughs, and its dim panes catching the color of the harbor sky. Somewhere below, thick syrup drops in patient intervals, each drop gathering, hanging, and falling with a small sound that is almost hidden by the building's slow breathing. The molds are not all at the same stage, and part of your work is simply remembering where each group is in its quiet passage from brown to pale. Some have only recently been filled and are still too warm or soft for your touch, while others are ready for their first covering, their surfaces firm enough to receive the clay. Farther along, older loaves have already taken one washing and may need another, because sugar intended for finer tables must be coaxed toward whiteness in layers rather than forced all at once. You step to the first row and remove the cloth or board that has kept dust from settling on the surface. The sugar beneath is not yet the clean white cone that will later stand upright in a shop window, but a grainy, damp, yellowish crown with a smell like warm treacle and burnt straw. With a small wooden tool, you smooth the top, not digging, not pressing too hard, only making a shallow bed into which the clay can be laid evenly. Then the first ladleful goes down, slow and pale, spreading across the sugar like milk poured over packed snow, though it is heavier than milk and colder in the hand. You guide it toward the edges, because the edges matter and because a narrow dry channel can leave a streak of darker sugar that will show later when the loaf is broken from its mold. The clay settles quietly, filling the round mouth of the mold, and for a little while it seems as though nothing is happening at all. But something is happening, as it always is. In work that depends on waiting, and below the surface the clean water in the clay begins to move. It slips downward grain by grain, carrying with it some of the darker syrup that has remained between the crystals, and under the pointed end of the mold that syrup will gather and drain away. It is not a sudden cleansing, and it is not perfect, but it is patient, and the patience is the reason the clayer is needed. You move to the next mold, and then the next, filling, smoothing, adjusting and listening while the room gradually gathers its morning sounds. A boy comes in with another pail, careful not to spill, and nods without speaking because voices travel strangely in the sugar house when the day is still young. From the boiling room there may be the softened knock of metal against metal, the scrape of a pan being tended, and the occasional low word from men whose own work has been going since before dawn. Danzig outside has known many kinds of trade, and sugar is only one of the goods that has passed through its gates, over its quays, and into its warehouses. Grain has stood in sacks along the river, timber has come down from inland forests, amber has been handled in small pieces by careful fingers, and barrels of many things have rolled across stones darkened by weather. Yet sugar has its own presence because it clings to everything it touches, and because the desire for sweetness sends small threads through kitchens, shops, ships, ledgers, and labouring rooms like yours. By the 1860s, sugar in this part of Europe might begin in fields of beet as well as in cane brought from warmer places, and the refinery might handle raw sugar whose earlier journey you would never see. You do not need to see the fields or the ships to know that every loaf in front of you has travelled through many hands, many ledgers, and many weather changes before it came to rest in its mould. Your place in that long passage is modest, yet the work is exact, and there is a kind of comfort in knowing the narrowness of your task. You are not asked to command the furnaces, bargain with merchants, or judge the worth of a whole cargo by sight and smell. You are asked to know the clay, the sugar surface, the draining point, the dampness of the room, the pace of seepage, and the moment when another layer will help rather than harm. It is a small kingdom, but it is yours for the hours of the shift, and the more quietly you move through it, the more clearly it seems to speak. As the morning widens, light enters through the high windows and shows the floating dust that the earlier dimness had hidden. Some of it is sugar dust, some of it is old plaster, some of it is clay dried at the rim of a tub, and all of it drifts lazily in the beams, as if the air has become visible for your benefit. The floorboards have been worn smooth in paths between the molds, and where water has been carried often, the wood has a darker polish from years of steps. You pause at a draining rack and look down into the receiving trough, where the syrup from older loaves has collected in a dull brown shine. It is not waste, not entirely, because in a refinery even the darker runnings may find another use, another boiling, another grade, another name in the language of sugar. Nothing that can still sweeten is thrown away easily, and the building is full of such second chances, where syrup becomes lower sugar becomes something useful, and the work circles back on itself. A sugar clayer learns to distinguish colors that other people might simply call brown. There is the brown of new raw sugar, lively and sticky, the brown of exhausted syrup, darker and slower, the amber stain at the base of a mold, and the faint beige blush that remains in a loaf after its first claying. There is also the whiteness that is not quite white, the pale cream that means progress, and the chalky surface of spent clay after it has done its work and begun to dry. When the clay dries on top of the loaf, it cracks in fine lines that look a little like river maps, branching gently from the center toward the rim. You lift those pieces away with care because underneath them the sugar may still be tender, and a rough movement can disturb the surface you need for the next washing. The dry clay comes away in flakes and curls, pale on top and stained underneath, a quiet record of what it has carried down through the loaf. This removal is slower than the laying, because taking away requires a different patience from putting on. You loosen the edges, lift what will lift, and brush away what remains with a tool kept for that purpose, while the air fills with a dry mineral smell. The clay that was smooth and wet in the tub has become dull and brittle, and in its changed state you can see the passage of water, sugar, and time more plainly than any ledger could show it. By then the room has warmed enough for coats to hang unused near the door, though the stone walls still hold the morning chill in their deeper places. A worker from another room may pass through carrying a message about a batch, and for a moment the claying room receives the warmer smell of boiled syrup from beyond the doorway. Then the door closes again, and your own room returns to its softer sounds. The scrape, the drip, the footstep, the pail set down carefully on wood. You have brought a small meal wrapped in cloth, perhaps black bread, a bit of cheese, and something salted enough to wake the mouth after hours of sweet air. Sugar fills the nose so completely that plain food becomes a relief, and the bite of rye or onion can feel almost clean in the middle of the shift. You eat standing or sitting on a low bench, not far from the tubs, because the molds do not need your attention every moment, but they must never be forgotten. The men talk quietly when they talk at all, and the talk is often practical, because practical talk can rest beside work without disturbing it. Someone mentions the dampness coming in from the river, someone says a cartwheel broke near the warehouse, someone wonders whether the next batch will need more time before claying. A joke may pass softly among them, not sharp enough to break the mood, only enough to remind the room that tired hands still belong to living people. Outside, bells may mark the hour from one of the churches, and their sound reaches the refinery, softened by distance, roof lines, and the thick air of the city. You do not need the bell to tell you how the day is moving, because the surfaces of the loaves tell you too, and the changing light across the shelves tells you even more gently. Still, there is reassurance in hearing the city keep its own time while you keep yours, as if each trade in Danzig were one small wheel in a large, unhurried clock. The city has many workers who understand this kind of measured life, though their hands know other materials. A cooper listens to staves, and hoops a miller listens to grain. A rope maker feels the twist of hemp, and a sugar clayer watches wet clay sink into sweetness with a patience that would be hard to explain to anyone in a rush. None of these jobs asks to be admired loudly, but each leaves its trace in the world, and each gives a person a way to pass the day with skill. When you return to the row, the first clay beds have already lost some of their shine. The surface dulls at the edges first, then slowly across the middle, and the change is slight enough that only an accustomed eye follows it easily. You lean close, not too close, and notice where one mold has drawn water faster than its neighbors, which may mean the sugar beneath is looser, or the surface was less firmly set. So you mark it in memory, because not every note is written down, and because the refinery depends on the quiet bookkeeping of trained senses. A ledger can record weight, grade, price, and date, but it cannot fully record the feel of a loaf under a smoothing tool, or the way a claying cracks when the room is too dry. Those things are carried in hands, eyes, shoulders, and in the small corrections made before anyone else notices a fault. There is a rhythm to walking the rows that can become almost soothing, provided the body is not too tired and the mind is allowed to settle into the task. You look, touch, scrape, refill, wipe the rim, move on, and return later, each action linked to the next by habit rather than command. The pail grows lighter, the bench grows farther, the tub waits for more stirring, and the rows behind you change almost invisibly as the water continues its slow descent. A sugar loaf in its mold is a patient thing, but it is not asleep. Its grains hold and release moisture, its darker syrup moves through narrow passages, and its shape, though hidden, is forming itself more firmly hour by hour. You think of this sometimes when the room is especially quiet, not in grand words, but in the simple understanding that many useful things are made by stillness as much as by effort. The clay bed is not meant to remain, and that may be part of its modest grace. It does its work by giving itself up, sending its water downward and taking the stain of syrup into its own body until what remains on top is poorer than what was laid there. Then it is lifted away, broken, carried out, and replaced, while the loaf beneath stands a little nearer to the whiteness expected of it. That whiteness is not merely color, because in the world beyond the refinery, it has meaning, price, and pride attached to it. A whiter loaf may sit in a better shop, be shaved with small tongs for tea, or be kept in a cupboard where children know not to touch it without permission. Yet here, before such social meanings gather around it, whiteness is a practical matter of drainage, crystal, water, and the careful discipline of repeated claying. The clayer does not see the parlors where the sugar will be used, and perhaps that is just as well, because the mind can rest more easily on the work itself than on all the places work may travel. You see the mold in front of you, the clay in your ladle, the rim needing a wipe, the trough needing attention, and the next row waiting under its cloth. The world becomes manageable when it is divided into such small acts, and the morning becomes less a thing to endure than a thing to move through. Near midday, the refinery has grown fuller and louder, though never in a way that entirely conquers the soft heaviness of sugar. Boots cross thresholds. A door bangs somewhere below. A horse snorts in the yard, and men call to one another over a delivery, their words blurred by walls and beams. The claying room receives these sounds as a pond receives falling leaves, each one touching the surface and then settling into the general quiet. You go down briefly to fetch more prepared clay, or perhaps to see that the next mixture has been properly strained. The stair is narrow enough that you turn slightly with the pail, keeping your shoulder from the wall and your step from the slick patch near the bottom. In the lower room, barrels stand against the brick, and the clay, water, and tools are kept with the plain order of things used every day. The clay itself may have come from some clean deposit known to the refiners, chosen because it is fine, pale, and obedient under water. It must be free of coarse grit, because grit would scar the sugar surface, and it must not bring unwanted taste or smell into the work. Once soaked and worked to the proper softness, it becomes almost humble, and earth made useful not by strength, but by fineness. You strain it through cloth or sieve, pressing out lumps with the back of the hand or the paddle, and the movement has the same slow certainty as mending a net or washing linen. Water clouds around it, clears a little, clouds again, and the paste gathers in the vessel below with a quiet weight. There are no fine speeches in this part of the day, only the sound of preparation, because a clayer who neglects the tub will find his mistake later in the loaf. A boy watches from the side, learning without being formally taught, as boys often do in workrooms where instruction is folded into usefulness. He sees how much water you add, how you test the mixture between finger and thumb, and how you refuse to hurry when the paste still holds a hidden graininess. If he is sensible, he learns that experience is not loud, and that the older hand often proves itself by waiting a little longer than the younger one would. When you return to the upper room, your first row is ready for its next attention. The earlier clay has dulled and cracked, and the syrup below has deepened in the trough, while the tops of the molds sit with that particular stillness that means something has changed inside them. You set down the fresh pail, flex your fingers, and begin the careful work of removing the spent layer. Piece by piece, the dried clay lifts away, some of it coming cleanly, some of it clinging near the rim where the sugar holds moisture. The underside is stained yellow or brown, and you lay the pieces aside without disgust, because they have simply done what they were meant to do. A small brush clears the last crumbs, and then the sugar surface appears, paler than before, damp, grainy, and faintly shining in the afternoon light. This is one of the quiet rewards of the clayer's day, not dramatic enough to speak of much, yet steady enough to sustain attention. The loaf does not praise you, the mold does not change shape before your eyes, and no bell rings for a properly removed clay bed. Still, the surface is better than it was, and that small improvement, repeated across rows and weeks, is the substance of the trade. You smooth again because each new claying needs its own bed, and because the surface left by removal is rarely perfect. Then the pale paste goes down once more, spreading over the top with the same slow weight as in the morning, though now your hand knows this particular mold a little better. The second covering may be thinner or thicker, depending on what the loaf has shown you, and the day continues by such small negotiated decisions. Through the window, the city has turned brighter, and the damp grey of early morning has lifted into a softer, busy light. You might see a strip of sky, a roof line, perhaps the top of a mast beyond the buildings, and if the window opens, the air may bring in tar, horse sweat, cabbage, smoke, and river water. The sugar house answers with its own sweetness, not fresh like fruit and not warm like baking bread, but deep, sticky, and persistent, as if molasses had entered the wood and decided to remain there. By afternoon, the body knows it has been working, though the work has not required great blows or heavy lifting without pause. The ache is in the wrist from stirring, in the fingers from scraping, in the shoulder from carrying pails, and in the back from bending over row after row. It is a quiet ache, the kind that comes from repetition more than strain, and it sits beside you like another worker who says little. There are trades where danger announces itself plainly, with flame, height, speed, or breaking metal, but the clayer's ordinary difficulty is more subdued. The floor can be slick, the air can be heavy, the hands can chap from water and clay, and sweetness can grow wearisome when it fills every breath for years. Yet even these discomforts become part of the known world, watched and managed, folded into the habits that keep a person moving steadily through the day. You rinse your hands in water that is never quite clean for long, and the pale swirl of clay mixes with the amber trace of sugar before draining away. The skin around the nails holds a whiteness that soap may not fully remove, and sometimes the smell of the refinery follows you home, tucked into cuffs and hair. In the evening, someone in the household may know where you have been before you say a word, because sugar and clay are not easily persuaded to let a worker go. But for now, the day is not finished, and the loaves still require the last round of inspection before the later workers take over, or the room is closed for the night. You walk the rows again, slower now, because afternoon light reveals flaws differently than morning light, and because fatigue can make a hand too quick if it is not watched. One mold has a rim that needs wiping, another has a clay layer pulling away unevenly, and another seems content enough to be left alone. The receiving vessels below must be checked, because syrup that overflows becomes a nuisance no one thanks you for making. You bend near the lower shelf and shift a vessel by a careful inch, feeling the small resistance of sticky wood beneath it. The syrup inside moves heavily, catching the light in a dark, glossy curve, and for a moment it seems as rich and mysterious as polished walnut. This darker syrup is part of the refinery's memory, carrying what the loaf has given up, and it has its own place in the economy of the building. It may be returned to boiling, sold as a lower product, or used in ways decided by men who calculate grades and yields with more interest than sentiment. You only know that it must be collected cleanly, because waste in a sugar house is noticed, and because sticky disorder breeds more work than any hand needs. Somewhere beyond your room, the finished loaves from earlier batches may be drying, standing free of their molds at last, pale cones with their pointed ends trimmed or smoothed. They will be hard when ready, sometimes so hard that a household uses nippers to break off pieces, and the white paper wrapped around them will make them seem cleaner and more delicate than the labor that formed them. Before that neatness, though, there is always this room, this clay, this damp surface, this steady, unseen washing. You may think, while working, of the strange path from beet field or cane hold to a cone on a merchant's shelf. Farmers, cutters, carters, sailors, boilers, clerks, coopers, inspectors, refiners and clayers all touch the story, though most of them never meet. The sugar loaf looks singular when it is done. One simple white form, yet it is made from many kinds of patience layered together, each one leaving almost no visible trace. In that way, the clayer's work resembles many quiet jobs that history mentions only in passing, if it mentions them at all. A person can spend years doing one necessary thing and leave behind no portrait, no monument, no line in a famous account, only the products that moved onward after his hands were done. But the absence of a grand record does not make the work less real, and in the claying room, with the light on the moulds, reality has no need to be grand. The refinery's owners may care for output, purity, markets, and the balance between cost and return, and those concerns float somewhere above your working day. Your concern is more immediate, more tactile, and perhaps more restful to imagine, because it begins with the question of whether the clay is right and ends with the question of whether the loaves can be left until morning. Between those questions lies the narrow path of the shift, and you follow it without needing to see far beyond the next task. As the afternoon thins, the color of the room changes again, and the high windows no longer brighten the dust so much as silver it. Shadows lengthen under the racks, and the earthenware molds take on a warmer tone, as though the day has rubbed a little amber across them. The clay in the pail cools once more where it stands, and the last ladlefuls fall with a quieter sound because everyone in the room has grown more inward. A man near the doorway cleans a tool against the edge of a bucket, not harshly, but with the weary care of someone who wants it ready for the morning. Another gathers the spent clay, now dry and stained, and carries it away in a vessel that leaves a pale dust on his sleeve. You check the row nearest the wall, where the air moves differently and drying can be slower, and you make a small correction that no one else will see. This is often how a day ends in such work, not with completion in the full sense, but with the proper leaving of things unfinished. The sugar will continue to drain after you are gone, the clay will continue to dull, and the syrup will continue its patient descent into the waiting vessels below. Good work in this room means arranging the unfinished so that it can proceed safely without your eyes upon it. You cover what should be covered, move what should be moved, and make sure the tools that touch sugar are not left in a state that would harden overnight. Sticky tools become stubborn tools, and stubborn tools slow the next morning before it has fairly begun. So the paddle is rinsed, the ladle wiped, the tub drawn closer to the wall, and the floor near the busiest row cleared of what might catch a tired foot. The boy who watched the clay being strained now sweeps near the door, raising little soft clouds that settle almost as soon as they rise. He has learned something today, perhaps not enough to name, but enough to carry in his hands tomorrow when he is asked to help again. Much of a trade passes that way, not as a lesson spoken once, but as 100 small sights gathered quietly until the body begins to understand. Before leaving, you stand for a moment among the molds, and the room seems less like a workplace than a place of waiting. The cones are hidden, the clay lies pale on their tops, the syrup below gathers in the dimness, and every part of the process continues at a pace older than any factory bell. In a city of merchants, ships, churches, gates and ledgers, this room keeps one of the softer times, measured by seepage, drying, and the slow persuasion of water. Your hands are clean enough, though not perfectly clean, and there is clay at the edge of one cuff where the cloth brushed a tub. You take your cap from its peg and feel the cooler air near the stair, where the warmth of the working rooms gives way to the draught from below. The day's sweetness remains in your throat, and when you breathe through your nose, you can still tell the difference between molasses, wet clay, wood, and the faint mineral dust of dried earth. Outside, Danzig has entered evening, and the cobbles hold the damp shine that comes when river air meets the cooling stones. Carts move more slowly now, warehouse stores stand half closed, and somewhere a woman carries a covered basket while a child walks beside her, stepping carefully around the dark patches in the street. The refinery behind you does not fall silent at once, but its sounds are reduced, softened, and drawn inward, like a stove settling after the fire has been banked. You walk home with the pace of someone who has spent the day in measured repetition, and the city's larger movements seem almost too broad after the narrow care of the claying room. A gull turns over the river, a rope creaks against a mooring post, and a bell from a church tower spreads its note through the evening air. The sugar in its molds does not hear the bell, but it keeps its own slow work all the same. At home the meal is plain, and plainness is welcome after hours among sweetness. Bread, broth, cabbage, Potatoes or a little fish can feel steadier than anything rich, and the hands that worked clay all day now hold a spoon, a cup, or the back of a chair with a different kind of tenderness. Work leaves the body gradually, not all at once, and even after washing, the fingers may still remember the shape of the ladle. Perhaps you sit near a small window while the light leaves the street, and you notice that evening has the same color as the damp clay before it is stirred. This is not a thought you would speak aloud, because many thoughts made by repetition are too slight for conversation. Yet it rests quietly in you. The world has many substances, and after a lifetime of work, a person begins to measure even the sky by the materials his hands know best. Sleep comes later, with the refinery still present in small ways, because the mind can continue a familiar motion after the body has stopped. You may see rows of molds behind your eyes, not sharply, but in the soft repeated pattern that follows steady labor. The ladle moves, the clay spreads, the surface dulls, the dry layer lifts, and the same act repeats without urgency, carrying the mind down as water carries darkness through sugar. By morning, the loaves will have changed again. The clay you left pale and wet will be cracked and drier, the troughs will hold fresh syrup, and the room will wait for footsteps, pails, brushes, and the first careful look of the day. Nothing in the process will have hurried to meet you, and nothing will have stopped because you went home. So the sugar clayer's days pass, not in great events, but in a sequence of touch, sight, dampness, and return. The work is repetitive, but repetition is not emptiness when the hand is trained and the material answers in small ways. Each morning brings clay to be stirred, each row brings loaves to be tended, and each evening leaves behind hidden cones growing paler in the dark. In the 1860s, while Danzig keeps its trade along the river and the wider world moves with ships, railways, letters, and ledgers, the claying room remains almost inward. It has its own weather, its own smells, its own hours, and its own form of attention, held between the sweetness of sugar and the cool patience of earth. You stand inside that attention day after day, and though history may pass by the door without writing your name, the loaves remember your work in the only way they can, by becoming what careful hands have helped them become. And when the next morning comes, it does not arrive all at once, but seeps into the room almost as slowly as water moves through a loaf. The windows first become less black, then grey, then faintly pearled with the river light, and the rows of molds take shape from the darkness, one by one. You enter before the day has made many demands, and the first thing you notice is the coolness that has gathered overnight around the tubs, the tools, and the earthenware cones. The clay layers left yesterday have dried in their own quiet fashion, some with broad cracks across their surfaces, some with fine branching lines like frost on a pane. You do not touch them immediately, because the eyes should always make the first inspection, and because a hasty hand can break what a patient glance would have understood. The troughs below hold new syrup, darker than tea and slower than oil, and its surface trembles only when your bootstep passes too near the rack. There is a kind of companionship in seeing that the room has worked while you were gone. The sugar has not slept, though it has been silent, and the clay has not rested, though it has lain perfectly still on top of the molds. In such a place, a worker begins to trust the unseen part of labor, that humble interval when nothing appears to happen, and yet the whole purpose of the task is being carried downward, grain by grain, through the hidden cone. You begin again by lifting the spent clay from the first row, and the flakes come away with a dry whisper that belongs only to this room. The underside of each piece is stained, sometimes golden, sometimes brown at the edges, and you read these colors without making a ceremony of it. If one piece is too pale beneath, perhaps the passage was weak, and if another is deeply marked, perhaps the loaf is especially rich in syrup and will need another patient washing before it can be trusted. Your brush moves softly over the exposed sugar, clearing clay dust from the little uneven places that remain after the flake has been lifted. The surface underneath has a damp sparkle where the crystals catch the weak morning light, and in that sparkle you can see how far yesterday's work has gone. It is never the bright glitter of clean snow, not yet, but it is lighter than it was, and the gradualness of the change feels honest. A senior refiner may come through the room at this hour, walking with a ledger tucked beneath one arm and a face still marked by the warmth of the boiling roux. He pauses beside a row, touches nothing, and looks at the clay with a practiced expression, because he too knows that whiteness is built from many small judgments. Perhaps he asks whether this batch will take another claying, and you answer simply, because in such matters, a long explanation is less useful than an accurate hand. The molds themselves are heavy earthen vessels, made to withstand dampness, heat, handling, and the repeated burden of sugar setting inside them. Their wide mouths receive the boiled mass, their narrow points allow the syrup to drain, and their rough outer surfaces hold the marks of use in chips, stains, and old repairs. When you handle one empty mold, you feel the weight of other hands before yours, potters, carriers, washers, fillers, and workers who knew the same cone shape long before you were given your first brush. In the 1860s, machines have already entered many sugar houses, and steam has become familiar in industries that once depended more heavily on arm, fire, and weather. Yet the claying of loaf sugar still asks for an intimacy that machinery does not easily replace, because the clay must be judged, applied, renewed, and removed according to the changing condition of each batch. The refinery may be part of a wider modern world, but in this room the work remains close to the body, close to the eye, and close to the old patience of craft. You prepare the new clay with water that has stood long enough to lose the harsh chill of the pump. The paddle enters the tub, and the first turn is always heavier than the later ones, because the settled clay resists disturbance before yielding into smoothness. As you stir, the surface folds over itself in pale ridges, and the sound is thick, soft, and steady, like a boot withdrawing from river mud at low tide. There is a right speed for stirring, just as there is a right speed for walking past sleeping children or pouring cream into a cup. Too fast, and the paste splashes, trapping small bubbles and sending spatters against the tub wall, where they dry into useless flakes. Too slow, and the lower clay remains dull and unmixed, waiting at the bottom like an unanswered question that will return later in the work. When the mixture is nearly ready, you test it between finger and thumb, pressing gently until you feel whether any grit remains. The clay should be fine enough to lie obediently across sugar, but not so watery that it becomes merely dirty water and drains without doing its office. This knowledge has no drama in it, though it carries the weight of the batch, and you have learned it by making mistakes quietly enough that the older men did not need to scold you twice. The younger workers sometimes ask how a man can tell so much from a smear of clay, and the truest answer is that he cannot at first. He can only repeat the work, feel the failures, watch the loaves, and begin again until the difference between too thin and nearly right becomes as noticeable as a draught beneath a door. Skill grows through such narrow distinctions, and the claying room is full of them, each one small enough to be missed by anyone who only passes through. By the time the city outside has begun its ordinary traffic, you have laid fresh clay on several rows. The first cartwheels are moving over the cobbles, and the sound comes through the walls in a softened rumble, mingling with the drip from the molds and the low creak of racks. Danzig streets are waking into commerce, but your own morning remains inward, bounded by tubs, coes, cloths, troughs, and the pale circles of clay settling on sugar. The refinery's location near water matters in ways that a visitor might not notice. Barrels and sacks arrive more easily, fuel finds its path, finished goods leave for merchants, and the dampness of the river air enters the building with every open door. On certain mornings, the whole claying room feels touched by the nearby harbour, not wet enough to be called wet, but softened, cooled, and faintly salted at the edge of its sweetness. You have learned to adjust for those mornings. A clay bed may dry more slowly, a sugar surface may seem more yielding, and the room may require longer intervals between one action and the next. In summer, when warmth gathers under the roof and the sweet smell thickens almost visibly, the work asks another rhythm, because drying quickens at the edges and hands become sticky sooner than usual. In winter, the clay keeps the cold like a stone lifted from a field before sunrise. Your fingers stiffen when the morning begins, and the first hour passes with the quiet labor of coaxing warmth back into knuckles and wrists. The refinery fires burn elsewhere, but their comfort reaches the claying room unevenly, and so you learn to work with wool at the throat, careful sleeves, and breath showing faintly near the window until the building has fully woken. Food tastes different in every season too, because the mouth grows tired of sweetness in ways that are hard to explain to someone who imagines sugar only as pleasure. A sour cucumber, a slice of dark bread, a bit of onion, or cold potatoes with salt can feel more welcome than cake after a morning among loaves. Even tea, if sweetened too heavily, may seem almost foolish after the long hours of breathing molasses, syrup, and damp crystals. At midday, the men sometimes sit near an open doorway if the weather allows, and the city moves before them in fragments. A porter passes with his shoulders bent beneath a load, a woman bargains near a cart, a dog noses along the wall, and the river smell lifts between the buildings whenever the breeze changes. You eat without haste, not because the pause is long, but because a person who rushes bread after slow work feels the haste too sharply. Conversation at such a meal may wander to prices, weather, family illness, church bells, boots that need mending, or rumors of changes in the refinery. It does not usually linger on the loaves themselves, because men who spend their hours with sugar do not always spend their rest speaking of sugar. Still, if a troublesome batch has been passing through the room, someone may mention it in a low voice, and everyone will know which row he means. The troublesome batches are remembered almost like difficult neighbors. One may set too loosely, another may hold color stubbornly, and another may seem obedient until the final turn from the mold reveals a streak that disappoints everyone. You cannot quarrel with sugar, but you can learn its moods, and over years those moods become part of the private weather of the job. After the meal, the afternoon work begins with the slightly heavier feeling that follows sitting down. The body resists for a minute, then returns to its pattern, and soon the brush, ladle, and pail resume their gentle circuit. The room is brighter now, and the clay looks whiter in the full light, though the true test is never the beauty of the layer when it is fresh, but the stain it carries when it is removed. You work beside another clayer in companionable silence, close enough to pass a tool, far enough that each man keeps his own rhythm. His way is not exactly yours, because no two hands smooth a sugar surface with quite the same pressure, and no two men judge a clay bed by precisely the same glance. Yet the loaves do not ask for sameness in a perfect sense, only steadiness, care, and results that satisfy the grade expected of them. Sometimes, when the room is very quiet, you hear the faint granular sound of sugar settling inside a mold. It is not a loud sound, nor one that would be noticed by a visitor, but to you it belongs among the small voices of the place. The building speaks through wood, clay, syrup, water, breath, and the occasional distant hiss of steam, all of them joining into a low industry that does not need to announce itself. There are records somewhere, in offices with ink and sand shakers, that give the refinery a different kind of existence. In those rooms, sugar becomes weight, grade, cost, sale, duty, shipment, and inventory, all of it made tidy enough to travel through correspondence. The claying room has another record, kept in stains on aprons, worn tool handles, softened floorboards, and the pale dust that gathers where dry clay is handled day after day. You know the feel of a ladle whose handle has been polished by many palms. Its wood is no longer rough, and near the grip it is darkened from water, sweat, and the natural oil of hands. When you lift it, there is a balance to it that a new tool lacks, and that balance becomes part of the work, as though the tool has learned with you. A cracked tool is set aside before it fails, because one broken handle can spill clay across a row and bring unnecessary trouble into an otherwise orderly day. A good brush is rinsed and shaped so the bristles do not harden badly, and a scraping tool is wiped clean before sugar dries along its edge. Such care may seem fussy to someone outside the trade, but every worker knows that neglected tools return the neglect at the least convenient moment. The clay tub, too, deserves attention beyond its obvious use. Its sides must be kept clear of dried scraps that could fall back into the paste, and its bottom must be stirred enough that nothing heavy sits unmixed beneath the smoother surface. At day's end, it is covered against dust, because sugar work is clean in its aim even when the room itself is marked by sticky, earthy, and smoky traces. A visitor might expect a sugar house to smell simply sweet, but the truth is deeper and more complicated. There is sweetness, yes, and sometimes it is so thick that it seems to coat the back of the tongue. But there is also wet clay, hot metal, coal smoke, damp wood, stale water, and the faint sourness that can rise from old syrup if a vessel is neglected. To work there is to live inside a layered smell, and after a time the layers become as familiar as rooms in a house. You can tell when you step inside whether a batch has been boiling hard, whether fresh clay has been mixed recently, or whether a drain vessel has been left too long. These signs do not arrive as thoughts exactly, but as small recognitions in the body, the way a person can tell by the air whether rain has already fallen nearby. The clayer's knowledge is partly in the nose, though no one puts that in a ledger. The whiteness sought in the loaf is also not the blank whiteness of modern paper, but a worked whiteness, a refined whiteness, a whiteness reached by repeated removals. Some loaves remain faintly creamy, some come nearer to clean ivory, and the best may seem almost luminous when broken from the mold and dried properly. Yet even then, if you hold them close, there is a memory of their passage, a trace of grain, a hardness, and a shape that tells of the mold that held them. When a loaf is ready to leave its mold, another part of the sugar house takes interest, though the clayer still cares what the result says about earlier work. The mold may be warmed or handled so the loaf loosens, and the cone is eased out with care, because a crack at this point wastes more than appearance. The loaf emerges pointed, solid, and pale, a form so simple that it almost hides the many decisions that made it. There is satisfaction in seeing one stand free. It rests with its broad base downward now, the reverse of its draining life, and its surface may be trimmed or dried further before wrapping. You might glance at it only briefly, because there are rows still waiting, but the glance is enough to confirm that clay, time, and judgment have done their quiet work together. Children in the city may know sugar mostly as a treat, something pinched or grated or dissolved, but to you it is also a structure, a material that can fail, crack, stain, set, soften, and improve. You know that sweetness has weight, that whiteness has labor in it, and that the clean cone on a shelf once sat hidden in an earthen mold beneath a layer of wet clay. Such knowledge does not spoil the sweetness, though it makes it less innocent and more interesting. In the later afternoon, when work has settled into its most familiar groove, your thoughts may move gently beyond the room without leaving it. You might think of your household, of boots that need repair, of the price of coal, or of a letter from someone inland, yet the hands continue their appointed motions. This is one of the mercies of repetitive work, when it is not too harsh and not too fast, that the mind can move quietly while the body remains useful, but the mind never goes so far that it forgets the row before it. A clay surface drying too quickly pulls you back, a darker drain alerts you, and the irregular edge of a mold asks for correction before the thought is fully formed. The claying room permits drifting, but only within the circle of attention, like a boat held by a long rope near a quiet dock. The day's second or third claying, depending on the quality required, has a softer mood than the first. By then the loaves have given up much of their stubborn darkness, and the work begins to feel like finishing rather than beginning, though finishing in sugar is still slow. You lay the clay more lightly, perhaps, or watch more closely for signs that the loaf has had enough, because too much washing can be its own kind of trouble. A good worker knows when to stop. This is true in carpentry, brewing, dyeing, baking, and in the pale, damp labor of the sugar house, where more action is not always better action. The desire to improve a loaf must be balanced against the knowledge that every process has a natural end, and that beyond that end, fussing becomes damage dressed as care. So you learn restraint, not as a noble word, but as a habit of the wrist. You let a loaf be when it should be left, even if your fingers itch to adjust a slight imperfection that will settle on its own. You walk past some molds without touching them, and this too is work, though no one watching from the doorway might understand it. During certain hours, the room seems almost made of pale circles. Each mold holds its round bed of clay at the top, each one dulling at a different stage, and each one hiding a cone whose shape your hands know without seeing. Looking across the rows, you might feel that you are tending a small field, not of plants, but of patient white coverings, under which sweetness ripens toward commerce. The comparison would not be foolish, because sugar itself began in fields, whether from beet roots pulled out of European soil or from cane cut in climates far from the Baltic air. By the time it reaches your room, the plant has been crushed, boiled, clarified, crystallized, and poured, until almost nothing remains of leaf, root, or stalk. Yet something agricultural still lingers in the pace, because the clayer cannot command maturity any more than a farmer can command harvest by shouting at the ground. The refinery's bells and schedules may press the workers toward efficiency, but the material keeps its own limits. Water moves only so quickly through a loaf. Crystals hold syrup in their small spaces, and clay does not cleanse by order, but by contact, weight, and time. This is why a clayer's patience is not merely temperament, but part of the machinery of the place, as necessary in its way as the pan, the mold, and the rack. When evening nears, you begin to prepare the room for another night of quiet labor without people. The fresh layers are checked, the vessels below aligned, the cloths arranged, and the path between racks cleared of anything that might be forgotten in dim light. A refinery can be busy, hot, and commercially ambitious, but at this hour the claying room becomes almost domestic, concerned with tidying, covering, and leaving things where morning hands will find them. The last light on the clay has a softness that makes the whole day seem gentler than it may have felt while your back was aching. Small ridges left by the ladle settle into smoother fields, and the wet surfaces hold a muted gleam before dulling into the first stage of dryness. You stand with the empty pail against your leg, listening to the building reduce itself from many sounds to fewer sounds, and then fewer still. The door to the boiling room opens, and warm air crosses the threshold with the smell of heated syrup, metal, and steam. For a moment the claying room feels less cool, and the pale surfaces shine more brightly under the brief disturbance. Then the door closes, the warmth thins, and the clay returns to its own temperature, modest and earthy, as if reminding you that not all transformations are made by heat. You wash the paddle with a care that has nothing showy in it. Water runs cloudy at first, then clearer, and the wood appears again beneath the film of clay. The handle is set where it can dry without warping, because tomorrow it will be needed before anyone is fully awake, and good work often begins the night before in how the simplest object is left. There is a small pleasure in seeing the tools arranged at the end of the shift. The brush lies with its bristles straight, the ladle rests against the tub, the cloth is folded, and the pails stand rinsed and open to the air. None of these things is beautiful in the grand sense, yet together they make a quiet order. And quiet order is one of the few luxuries a working room can keep for itself. When you step back and look once more across the rows, the sugar is hidden again beneath clay, and the room appears almost unchanged from the morning. But you know it is not unchanged, because the syrup below has darkened, the loaves have paled, the clay has been renewed, and your own body carries the evidence of hours. Work often looks like this from a distance, as if little has happened, while up close everything has been altered by small, repeated acts. The lamps are not bright yet, but someone has lit one near the lower stair, and its flame bends faintly when the door opens to the cooler passage. The yellow light touches the nearest molds and leaves the farther ones in a grey calm, making the racks seem longer than they are. In that half-light, the claying room could belong to any year, because clay, sugar, and waiting do not age in the same way as machines. You leave with the smell of the room following softly, and the evening outside receives you without ceremony. The city has its own damp breath, its own wheels and voices, its own cooking smells rising from windows, and its own lamps coming awake one by one. Behind you, in the refinery, the loaves continue downward through their hidden work, while the clay darkens underneath and the troughs wait with patient mouths. The next day will bring more of the same, and that sameness is not a failure of the story, but the truth of the job. A sugar clayer passes his days inside repetition, and repetition is where his skill grows, where his attention settles, and where his life makes contact with the world's appetite for sweetness. The work does not need novelty to be full, because each batch differs slightly, each morning carries its own air, and each hand laid to the clay has to decide again what care means today. Sometimes, On a Sunday or a rare free afternoon, you might pass a shop window and see a sugar loaf displayed in clean wrapping. It stands there neat and almost formal, a pale cone among other goods, with none of the dampness, staining, scraping, weighting, or early light visible around it. You do not stop for long, perhaps only long enough to recognize the shape and wonder whether that loaf passed through your room, under your brush, beneath one of your careful layers of clay. Then you move on, because the city is full of things made by people who do not stand beside them once they are finished. Bread leaves the baker, rope leaves the rope walk, cloth leaves the loom, and sugar leaves the refinery in a silence more complete than the silence in which it was refined. The finished object has its own life after labor, and the worker must be content with having guided it only part of the way. That contentment is not always easy, and no honest account of the clayer's life should pretend that every day feels peaceful. There are sore mornings, poor batches, cold rooms, strained eyes, and the kind of tiredness that makes even a familiar tool seem heavier than it should. Yet within those difficulties, there remains a steadiness, because the work is known, the motions are trusted, and the material responds slowly enough for a careful person to follow. A man who spends years with sugar loaves becomes attentive to gradual change, perhaps more than he realizes. He learns that whiteness can come by repeated gentle washings, that darkness can be drawn out without violence, and that the patient downward movement of water may accomplish what force would only spoil. Such lessons may never be spoken at table, but they can settle into a life giving even ordinary waiting a different texture. And so the days keep their soft procession. Morning clay, midday inspection, afternoon renewal, evening order, night drainage, and then morning clay again. Each part returning like a familiar tune played quietly in another room. The city shifts around the refinery, goods arrive and depart, names change in ledgers, and still the clayer bends over the molds, smoothing the surface with a hand that has become patient through use. There may be snow along the quay in winter, lying in grey ridges where wheels have pressed it aside, while inside the claying room the damp cold makes every tool feel newly washed. There may be summer heat, with flies nosing at the sweet air and the high windows open to any breeze the river will spare. There may be autumn fog so thick that the city seems folded in wool, and spring mornings when the light returns earlier than expected and the first pale gleam finds the clay already stirred. All these seasons enter the work not as grand chapters, but as adjustments in the hand. More water here, less waiting there, a covering kept longer, a row watched twice, a pail moved nearer the warmer wall, a door opened briefly and closed before damp air can overstay its welcome. The clayer does not master weather, but he answers it in small, practical ways, and practical answers repeated over years become a form of quiet wisdom. If you had to name the center of the job, it might be attention without impatience. The clay cannot be abandoned, but neither can it be hurried into usefulness. The loaf cannot be ignored, but neither can it be improved by constant interference. You stand between action and waiting, learning each day how much to do and how long to let the unseen part proceed alone. That balance is what gives the room its particular calm, even when the wider refinery is busy. The boiling rooms may have heat and timing, the warehouse may have lifting and accounts, the yard may have horses and shouting, but here the important changes are slow enough to be nearly silent. It is a place where a person can hear the meaning of a drip, read the dryness of clay, and feel time moving through material rather than across a clock face. As night settles again, the refinery's windows darken from the outside, and the last workers move through the passages with tired steps. In the claying room, the rows remain pale-topped and still, receiving the darkness without complaint. The tools are where they should be, the pails are clean enough for morning, and beneath each clay bed the sugar continues its quiet passage toward a whiter form. By morning the dried clay will have taken on the color of what it has drawn away, and you will know at a glance which loaves have yielded easily and which ones are still holding their darker heart. The room will smell of earth and syrup again, though a little cooler than before, and the first touch of the brush will send a fine pale dust into the air. You will breathe carefully then, not with worry, but with the ordinary caution of someone who has learned that even gentle work has its own small rules. There are days when the clay lifts almost beautifully, coming away in curved pieces that keep the memory of the mold's round mouth. You can place such pieces aside with hardly any brushing needed, and the sugar below appears smooth enough to receive another layer after only a light touch. On other days, the clay clings stubbornly, especially near the rim, and you must loosen it with patient pressure, taking care not to tear the damp sugar surface beneath. The rim is often where trouble begins, because the edge of a mold is both a boundary and a place of weakness. If clay is too thin there, the water may choose an easy path and leave part of the loaf less cleansed than the rest. If clay is piled too heavily, it may crack badly, slump, or make a rough crown that later dries unevenly and asks for extra attention when the day is already full. So you circle each mouth with care, smoothing not only the middle, where the eye naturally rests, but the outermost ring where a careless worker might leave a small fault hidden in plain sight. Your fingers know the gesture, and the ladle follows the same arc so often that the movement begins before thought finishes giving permission. In time, the hand becomes quieter than the mind, and often wiser, because it remembers the molds without needing to name them. The earthenware mouths are not perfectly alike, however neatly they were made. Some rims have a slight lean, some have chips worn smooth by use, and some hold a stain that no washing has removed since long before you came to the refinery. You learn these differences in the same way a person learns floorboards at home, not by deliberate study, but by meeting them again and again in the ordinary passage of the day. A new mold has a certain plainness, almost a stiffness, as though it has not yet entered fully into the life of the room. An old mold seems to belong at once, with its dulled surface, its darkened lower point, and its small scars from years of filling, draining, washing, and being set back in rows. To someone who does not handle them, they may all look the same, but to you they are a quiet company, each one holding sugar in its own slightly different way. When the sugar has drained enough, the lower opening of the mold must be watched, because the passage downward can slow, thicken, or clog. The pointed end, where the darker syrup gathers and slips away, is not the place that visitors admire, yet it is where much of the refining announces itself. A clayer who watches only the white top of the mold has understood only half the room, because the proof of the work is also beneath, in the dark runnings that leave the loaf behind. You bend to check the vessels below, and the smell is stronger there, deeper and warmer, even when the air is cool. Syrup gathers in slow curves against the sides, and when you lift a vessel carefully, the liquid follows the motion reluctantly, like something still deciding whether to move. It clings to wood, metal, and skin with equal patience, and if a drop reaches your sleeve, it will stiffen there by evening into a small amber mark. Those marks are common enough that no one notices them unless they are excessive. Aprons carry them, cuffs carry them, and sometimes the front of a coat has the dull sheen of old sweetness rubbed thin by repeated washing. The clayer's clothing is a kind of record, though not a record any office would keep, and the stains speak of work that has passed through the hands and into the cloth. A wife or mother may scrub those marks at home with soap, warm water, and a patience not so different from yours. Some stains lighten and surrender, while others remain faint but visible, becoming part of the garment's ordinary life. In this way, the sugar house reaches beyond its walls, carried into kitchens, wash basins, sleeping rooms, and the small domestic corners where labor is cleaned, mended, and made ready to return. The refinery itself also requires cleaning, though it is never truly free of its own nature. Sugar dust settles where it can, syrup finds corners, clay dries on rims, and water leaves pale tracks as it runs across boards and stones. The room can be orderly without being spotless, because the materials are persistent, and because a working place that handles damp earth and sticky sweetness will always bear some trace of both. At intervals, racks are washed more thoroughly, vessels scoured, tubs scraped, and the floor given attention beyond the daily wiping near the busiest rows. This work is less delicate than laying clay, but it belongs to the same quiet discipline, because neglect grows quickly in a sugar house. A little dried clay falls into a tub, a little old syrup turns sour, a little grit clings to a tool, and suddenly the careful whiteness of the loaf is being troubled by yesterday's laziness. So cleaning becomes another form of tending. You scrape without anger, rinse without haste, and set things to dry where they will not gather more dirt than they lose. The water turns cloudy, then amber, then grey, and the buckets are carried away with the heavy gait that comes when a man does not wish to slosh what he has just collected. On such cleaning days, the room sounds different, with more water, more scraping, and more footsteps moving across places usually left undisturbed. The molds that are empty stand aside in groups, their interiors exposed, and they look almost vulnerable without sugar in them. You can see the faint rings left by past fillings, the darker stain near the point, and the smoothing made by hands that have reached inside to inspect or clean. The empty mold has a smell of fired earth, old syrup, and dampness. It is less sweet than the full mold, but in some ways more revealing, because it shows the vessel's own life apart from the sugar it holds. When you rinse it, water runs from the narrow end in a thin stream, and for a moment it resembles the syrup's path, only cleaner and quicker, a rehearsal of the work to come. Drying the molds matters too, because too much dampness at the wrong time changes how the sugar sets and drains. They are left where air can move around them, not in a hard draft, but in enough circulation that water does not linger unseen. In winter, this drying may be slow, and in summer it may happen faster than expected. So even the empty vessels ask to be understood in relation to season and room. Beyond the claying room, the refinery has other temperaments. The boiling rooms are warmer, brighter at the fires, and more anxious in their timing, because syrup thickens under heat and must be watched closely. The storage areas are darker and calmer, with barrels, crates, sacks, and wrapped loaves arranged according to decisions made by trade rather than by touch. You pass through these other places sometimes, though they are not the center of your day. Their smells cling differently, their men speak differently, and their tools have other weights and purposes. Yet all of them are joined by the sugar's passage, and when you return to the claying room, you return to the part of that passage where heat has already done its great work, and cool patience has taken over. There is a humility in working after the boil. The dramatic transformation from juice or raw sugar to thick mass has already happened elsewhere, under steam, flame, copper, and watchful timing. Your work does not roar or foam, but it refines what has been made, drawing away what remains too dark, too sticky, too unfinished, until the loaf becomes suitable for the households and shops that will never see the clay. This later work has its own dignity, because finishing is often less visible than beginning, though it may decide how the finished thing is judged. A chair may be built strongly, but a rough surface troubles the hand. Cloth may be woven well, but poor finishing disappoints the eye. So too with sugar, where the clay's repeated washings may be the difference between a common loaf and one that earns a better place in a merchant's stock. Merchants may speak of quality as if it were a word on paper, but quality in your room is a sequence of small acts made at the right moment. It is a ladle held steady, clay mixed fine, a rim smoothed, a dried layer lifted without tearing, and a row left overnight under conditions that allow the unseen work to continue. Quality is not an idea floating above the molds, but a practice performed with damp hands. Sometimes the refiner brings news of a customer's requirements, not in detail perhaps, but enough to change the attention in the room. A batch may need to be especially pale, or another may be acceptable at a lower grade, and those differences shape how many claying rounds it receives. You do not see the customer, and the customer does not see you, but a preference spoken in an office finds its way into the thickness of clay on your ladle. Such connections are quiet, nearly invisible, yet they thread the day to the wider world. A merchant in another city may prefer a certain whiteness. A household may trust a certain shop, and a shop may trust a refinery whose loaves arrive with reliable color and firmness. Behind that reliability are workers who turn up before the rooms are warm, who test clay between finger and thumb, and who correct the little faults that commerce never learns to name. The sugar trade has its hard histories beyond your room, and no sweetness in Europe has ever been separate from labor, land, ships, capital, and power. But your own day, as it passes in Danzig, is shaped less by distant argument than by the immediate responsibility of the molds before you. A calm account can hold both truths at once, that the wider world is complicated, and that a worker's hand still meets the material in a plain, particular moment. In the 1860s, Beet sugar has altered European refining in lasting ways, giving northern and central regions a source of sweetness rooted in their own fields. The older cane trade still matters, with its long routes and colonial burdens, but beet has brought factories nearer to farms, rail lines, and inland towns. Danzig, with its port, warehouses, and mixed commercial life, stands at a meeting place of such flows where goods from river, rail, and sea can be handled, transformed, and sent onward. You may not think in those terms while scraping clay from a mold. Still, the materials around you carry that larger history, whether or not anyone pauses to speak of it. The sugar loaf is modest in shape, but it belongs to a web of fields, ships, vats, customs houses, shop counters, kitchen tables, and hands like yours, moving steadily in rooms where history is felt as work. A long day in the claying room gives a person many chances to notice light. Morning light is grey, and careful entering like a visitor who does not wish to wake anyone. Midday light shows every flaw, every dried ridge, every tacky footprint, while evening light forgives the roux a little, softening the racks and making even stained vessels seem almost warm. On clear winter days, the light can be pale enough that the fresh clay and the outside sky seem related. On rainy days, the windows blur and the room turns inward, lit more by lamps and reflected surfaces than by any brightness from the street. The sound of rain on roofs and gutters fits well with claying, because both are arts of falling water, one from clouds and one from pale earth laid over sugar. You listen to that rain while working, and the steady sound loosens the mind. The clay spreads, the rain falls, the syrup drains, and the whole building feels as though it has entered a single slow motion, repeated everywhere at different scales. Even the carts out seem to pass more quietly when the streets are wet, their wheels softened by water and mud. In dry weather, the room has another mood. Dust rises more readily, clay edges crack faster, and the worker must notice whether a layer is drying before its water has done enough work below. The air can feel sharper then, less forgiving, and the surfaces of sugar and clay seem to ask for closer watching, as if the room has lost some of its natural patience. Weather teaches clayers because weather enters everything. It enters the clay through water, the sugar through drying, the body through cold fingers or damp shirts, and the building through swelling boards, sweating walls, and drafts under doors. No one needs to make a philosophy of this for it to be true. The day's conditions are simply present, and the work answers them in small adjustments. There is also a weekly rhythm, though sugar houses do not always rest as neatly as church bells might wish. Some tasks press forward because materials cannot wait entirely on custom, and certain stages must be tended when they are ready. Even so, the week has a shape, with busier fillings, slower inspections, cleaning intervals, and the ordinary human hope that a little time away from the room may arrive before the body grows too heavy. On a quieter morning, you may hear more of the city than usual. A distant bell, a cartman's call, the creak of harness and the movement of feet outside the wall come through in fragments. These sounds remind you that while you bend over hidden cones, other workers are also beginning their repetitive offices, each one entering the day through his own door, tool, smell, and obligation. The lockkeeper watches water levels, the warehouse porter shoulders sacks, the printer sets letters, the lamplighter trims and tends, and you, in your claying room, spread wet earth over sugar so it may grow pale by degrees. None of these labors is spectacular when seen from far away, yet each one steadies the world in a small place. The city is held together by such continuities, by people doing work that disappears into use. As the day lengthens, your hands become more certain, though not less careful. The first hour may require warming into the task, but later the body finds its pace, and the movements connect smoothly from row to row. A pail is filled before it is quite empty, a cloth is shifted before dust can settle, and a vessel below is changed before syrup reaches the point of inconvenience. That kind of timing feels natural after years, but it was not natural at the beginning. At first, every action had to be remembered separately, and the room seemed full of chances to do something too late or too soon. Then, little by little, the order entered you, until the day no longer felt like a chain of instructions, but like one continuous motion with many gentle parts. A skilled player can appear almost idle at moments, because much of his work lies in seeing rather than acting. He may stand with arms folded, looking at a row, while a stranger thinks nothing is being done. But in that stillness, he is measuring dampness, color, cracking, drainage, and time. And when he finally moves, he may need only one small correction to save a loaf from unevenness. This is the quiet authority of experience. It does not hurry to prove itself, and it does not cover uncertainty with noise. It waits, observes, and acts with enough confidence to be gentle, because gentleness in a working room is often the result of long practice rather than softness alone. Near the end of a long week, fatigue can make the room seem larger than it is. The rows stretch farther, the pails hang heavier, and the clay in the tub resists the paddle with what feels like personal stubbornness. You keep working, not with bitterness, but with the simple endurance common to tradespeople whose lives are built from repeated mornings. The body may complain, yet the rhythm helps carry it. Stir, lift, pour, smooth, look, scrape, rinse, return, and within that sequence there is enough familiarity to move through weariness without fighting it too sharply. The work becomes a path worn through the day, and even tired feet can follow a path they know. If a new worker spills clay, the room responds not with panic, but with a practical gathering of cloths, pails, and quiet correction. Clay can be cleaned, sugar can sometimes be saved, and embarrassment fades faster when no one gives it too much air. Most men in the room have made some version of the same mistake, and the older ones know that careful workers are not made by humiliation, but by remembering the feel of the error. The spilled clay is heavier on the floor than it looked in the ladle. It spreads underfoot, pale and dull, and if not cleaned quickly, it becomes slippery in one stage and stubborn in the next. You help scrape it up, rinse the place, and return to the row, because the work is larger than the mishap, and the loaves continue their slow demands. There is kindness in such ordinary recovery, though no one may call it kindness. It is simply the way a room survives mistakes without turning every small failure into a storm. The sugar house has enough difficulty from weather, materials, and schedules, and the workers who last are often those who know how to correct a thing and then let the correction be enough. Sometimes the clayer works alone for an hour, and the room deepens around him. Without nearby speech, the small sounds gain definition. The brush against sugar, the drip below, the settling of a rack, the faint sucking sound of clay as the ladle leaves the tub. Such hours can feel almost private, as though the world has narrowed to one person and 100 waiting cones. In that privacy, thoughts may come from long ago. You may remember the first time you entered a sugar house, when the sweetness seemed pleasant and strange, before it became part of your clothing and breath. You may remember an older worker guiding your hand away from pressing too hard on a loaf, saying little, but showing enough that the lesson stayed. You may remember being surprised that sugar needed earth to become white. The idea still has a certain quiet wonder, that something pulled from the ground, soaked and smoothed, should help draw darkness out of sweetness. The process is practical chemistry in workman's clothing, though no one in the room needs grand scientific language to trust what repeated use has shown. The clay does not whiten by magic. Its water dissolves and carries away remaining syrup, while its fine body holds moisture in place long enough for the washing to proceed evenly. Yet the explanation, however useful, does not remove the simple charm of seeing a pale layer laid over amber sugar and finding, hours later, that the hidden loaf has changed. Many processes in old industries have this double nature, plain when explained and quietly remarkable when lived. Dye enters cloth through repeated baths, leather changes under tanning pits, grain becomes flour by grinding stones, and sugar becomes whiter under a blanket of wet clay. The worker learns both the reason and the ritual, because daily labor is made from knowledge and repetition braided together. As evening gathers once more, you cover the prepared clay against dust and set the empty vessels in their places. The room is not silent yet, but it has begun to lower its voice, and the men speak less as each finishes the part that can be finished. Outside, the city's lamps appear in the damp air like small golden smears, and the river takes the last light into its slow, dark surface. You take one more look at the rows, because leaving is also part of tending. A mold at the far end catches your eye, and you cross to smooth a place where the clay has pulled thin near the rim. The correction takes only a moment, but the moment matters, and after it is done, the whole row seems easier to leave. Then the tools rest, the tubs are covered, and the claying room accepts the night again. Under each pale surface, water continues downward with the quiet determination of gravity, carrying color into the waiting vessels below. The sugar holds its shape in darkness, the clay gives up its wetness, and the long, unhurried work proceeds without witness, as it has proceeded through so many nights before. And in the dark hours, when the refinery no longer carries the full weight of voices and boots, the loaves become almost like quiet instruments, each one answering the clay in its own hidden way. The racks stand without movement, yet within the molds there is a slow exchange between sweetness and water, between crystals and the darkest syrup still caught among them. If you could listen closely enough, perhaps you would hear only the smallest drops falling into the vessels below. But those drops are the night's own handwriting, marking what the day has prepared. By the time you return, the room has changed again without seeming to have moved. The air is cooler, the clay has lost its wet shine, and the surface of each mold shows the patient work of hours when no hand interfered. You set down your cap, rub warmth into your fingers, and begin the first round of looking, because morning in the claying room always begins with attention before it begins with action. Some rows are nearly ready for removal, and others still need the clay to sit a little longer, especially where the air has been damp near the wall. You pass them by without touching, because leaving a thing alone at the proper moment is as useful as lifting it away. This kind of waiting can be difficult for a younger worker, who feels that work must always show itself in movement. But the older clayer knows that stillness may be the most productive part of the room. You begin with the molds nearest the window, where drying has gone well, and the clay cracks have widened into soft, irregular patterns. The first piece lifts with a faint scrape, bending slightly before it breaks, and its underside shows a brown stain that fades toward the edges. You hold it for a moment over the waste vessel, not admiring it exactly, but reading it, as though the spent clay has returned from the loaf with a report. The report is never written in full, and it never gives more than signs. A dark center may tell you the sugar has released well through the middle, while pale edges may suggest the water did not travel evenly across the whole crown. A brittle layer that breaks into powder may have dried too quickly, and a layer that clings damply may need more time before the surface below can be safely opened. Each sign changes what you do next, though the changes are small. Perhaps you brush longer at one edge, smooth more gently in the middle, lay the next clay bed thinner, or leave a neighboring mold until after the meal. These are not grand decisions, but a refinery is partly made of such humble corrections, and the quality of the loaf depends on them, more often than anyone outside the room might suppose. When the sugar surface appears, it has a quieter color than before. The first raw warmth has softened, the deeper amber has been drawn down, and the top now shows a pale, damp grain that catches the light, like wet sand at the river's edge. You touch it lightly with the tool, feeling whether it will bear smoothing, and the surface answers through a resistance so slight that only repeated years make it clear. There are mornings when the whole row seems to behave, when each clay bed lifts cleanly, and each loaf beneath looks ready for the next step. Such mornings are pleasant in a subdued way, like finding that the fire has caught well, or that boots dried properly overnight. No one celebrates them loudly, because easy work still requires work, yet the body feels the difference and moves with a quieter gratitude. Other mornings bring resistance from the beginning. A vessel has filled more than expected, a mold has drained unevenly, a clay mixture from yesterday has left a rougher surface than you like, or the damp air has slowed everything in the corner nearest the outside wall. Then the day becomes more careful, and you draw your patience close around you, because impatience in a claying room only multiplies the small difficulties it wants to escape. The clayer's patience is not dreamy or vague. It is practical, active, and awake, even when the outward rhythm remains slow enough to soothe the listener half into sleep. It notices the thickness of a paste, the dulling of a shine, the temperature held by earthenware, the weight of a pail, and the way one loaf differs from another, though all were filled from the same boiling. You prepare a fresh tub, and the clay accepts the paddle with that familiar pull at the wrist. It has settled heavily at the bottom, as all wet earth will, and the first work is to bring the lower part back into the upper, folding what has sunk into what remained loose. The movement is circular, but not hurried, and the whole tub slowly becomes one substance again, pale and smooth enough to trust. A boy brings water and stands aside, watching your hand. He is learning not merely the task, but the pace of the task, which is harder to teach because it lies between laziness and haste. You tell him to pour a little and then a little more, and though the words are plain, the lesson is that useful quantities often arrive by degrees rather than in bold amounts. He pours, waits, and watches while the paddle turns. The clay loosens, shines, and folds more easily, and you show him the ribbon that falls from the lifted paddle when the mixture is near its proper body. It should fall without splashing too thinly and without breaking too heavily. A simple test that contains more judgment than it seems to contain when first explained. The boy nods, and perhaps he understands a little. Perhaps he understands only that you are satisfied, which is already something, because confidence in a working room passes first through imitation before it settles into knowledge. One day, if he stays, he will test the clay with his own fingers and feel a difference he could not have named when he was younger. There is comfort in this passing on of small knowledge, especially in trades where written instruction would never be enough. A manual might tell a person that clay should be prepared to a proper consistency, but it cannot fully give the touch of proper consistency to the thumb and forefinger. For that there must be mornings, mistakes, corrections, and the company of people who have already spent years learning what their hands can quietly tell them. The fresh clay is carried to the row, and the pale handle presses against your palm with an old familiarity. You pour a measured amount into the ladle and lower it over the sugar, letting the paste spread rather than forcing it. The top of the mold receives it softly, and the pale surface widens toward the rim, covering yesterday's exposed grain beneath a new wet stillness. You guide the edge carefully, because edges remain the small test of care. The clay should lie evenly all around, neither retreating from the side nor heaped against it, and your tool moves in a slow circle that leaves no obvious mark. A visitor might see only a man smoothing mud over sugar, but you feel the delicacy of the act, because too much pressure disturbs the loaf and too little leaves the layer uncertain. The row takes time. One mold after another receives its covering, and your body settles into the calm sequence of lifting, pouring, smoothing, wiping, and moving on. At first the eye watches each act closely, then the rhythm takes over, and the room begins again to feel like a place where time has been lengthened and softened for the sake of the work. Beyond the wall, the city's day grows more audible. A wagon passes, iron rims grinding softly over stone, and voices rise from the street in practical fragments, asking, bargaining, greeting, calling, then fading again. The refinery does not shut out the world, but it thickens it, turning outdoor noise into something gentler before it reaches the rows of molds. In the yard below, deliveries may be arriving. A cart with barrels, a man with sacks, a clerk with a paper tucked into his coat. Each one belongs to the wider motion that keeps the sugar house supplied and emptied. Their work is connected to yours, though only briefly visible, because what comes in through the yard must eventually pass through rooms like this, one before leaving in a more valuable form. Sometimes raw sugar arrives in a condition that men discuss with careful seriousness. It may be darker, lighter, more damp, more promising, or more troublesome than expected, and those first qualities will echo through boiling, setting, claying, and drying. By the time the batch reaches you, much has already been decided, yet your work remains a final patience applied to a material whose earlier life still shows itself. The claying room is therefore both late and central in the process. It comes after heat, clarification, and crystallization, but before the loaf can be trusted to the world as a clean, saleable cone. You work in that narrow passage between making and finishing, where a product becomes not merely sugar, but sugar of a certain appearance, grade, and reputation. Reputation matters in a port city, where goods are compared, remembered, and spoken of by merchants who may never touch clay themselves. A refinery whose loaves are uneven or stained will be noticed, and a refinery whose sugar holds a dependable quality will be trusted. Yet behind that trust are hours so ordinary that no merchant's praise could describe them properly. Hours of wet clay and quiet inspection under high windows. At midday, the light grows stronger, and the claying room loses some of its morning softness. Every smear on the table, every dusting of dry clay, every amber thread along a trough becomes visible, and the room seems more honest than beautiful. You do not mind this, because a workplace should be allowed to show the truth of its work, and truth in such a room is sticky, pale, damp, worn, and useful. Your meal is taken near the same place as before, and the bench has a familiar unevenness beneath you. The bread is dense, the cheese is plain, and the water tastes faintly of the vessel that carried it. But after a morning of sweetness, these things are welcome. You eat slowly, while another man wipes his knife on a cloth and speaks of a cousin who has found work near the docks. The talk drifts, pauses, returns, and fades without needing to fill the whole interval. Men accustomed to shared labor often understand silence better than strangers do, and a quiet meal can be companionable even when no one is telling a story. The refinery sounds continue around the pause, reminding you that rest here is not a stopping of the whole world, but only a small sheltered eddy within it. After eating, you notice how the smell of sugar returns more strongly when you stand. It had retreated during the meal, pushed aside by bread, salt, and the thought of home, but now it comes back as though the room has leaned toward you again. You take up the brush, and the day resumes with the same unhurried insistence as a tide. The afternoon may be given partly to loaves farther along in their making, ones that have already received enough claying and are ready to be prepared for drying or removal from the mold. This stage asks for a different care, because the loaf that has survived many slow washings can still be damaged by rough handling at the end. The point, the broad base, the skin of crystals, and the firmness of the whole cone must be respected. When a mold is ready, it may be shifted from the rack with two hands, held firmly but not clutched. The earthenware is heavy, and the sugar inside adds its own weight, so the body must move with balance rather than force. You have seen men lift too quickly and regret it, not always because the mold breaks, but because the loaf inside can crack where no one sees it until later. There is an art to freeing the loaf. Warmth may help loosen the sugar from the sides, and gentle handling persuades what roughness might fracture. When the cone finally releases, it emerges with a compact silence. No flourish, no announcement, only a pale form that has been hidden from sight since the hour it was poured. The first look matters. You scan the surface for streaks, cracks, stubborn color, and places where drainage has left an irregular mark. A good loaf has a pleasing firmness to the eye, a shape that seems both simple and inevitable, as though it had always intended to become that cone and merely needed the refinery to reveal it. If it is not perfect, it may still be useful. Sugar has grades, markets, and purposes, and not every loaf is meant for the finest table or the most exacting buyer. There is a merciful practicality in that, because workrooms know that the world uses many qualities, and usefulness is broader than perfection. Still, a Clare takes quiet pride in the loaves that come clean. He may not claim them aloud, especially when many hands have made them, but he knows which rows he tended, which difficult batch improved, and which pale cone bears the result of his repeated care. Pride in such work is not vanity. It is the inward satisfaction of seeing that attention has left the material better than it was. Finished loaves are set where air can continue to do what air must do. They need drying, hardening, and handling according to their state, and even after they leave the mold, they are not entirely beyond concern. Sugar that seems hard may still hold dampness within, and dampness poorly managed can trouble storage, wrapping, and sale. You walk past the drying loaves sometimes and feel that they belong to a later chapter of the same quiet story. They stand in rows like pale towers, modest and upright, each one a little irregular when seen closely, despite the common shape imposed by the mold. Their whiteness has a matte calm, and if the light falls gently on them, they almost seem to give back the day's brightness in softened form. A worker may trim a rough base or remove a small irregularity. Another may wrap, move, weigh, or record them, while the clayer returns to the still hidden loaves that have not yet reached that stage. The finished and unfinished stand near one another in the building, reminding everyone that the process is not a line you walk once, but a set of overlapping times happening under the same roof. Some loaves are beginning, some are washing, some are drying, some are leaving, and some exist already in memory as a troublesome batch or a successful one. This layering of time gives the refinery its peculiar feeling, because yesterday's work, today's work, and tomorrow's concerns are always present together. You move among them without surprise, having learned that industrial time is not only the clock, but the condition of each material in its own progress. Toward the middle of the afternoon, a fine mist of fatigue enters the room. It is not enough to stop anyone, but enough to make every man quieter, as if words themselves require more strength than they did in the morning. Hands keep working, shoulders shift, boots scrape, and the old sounds continue, though now they seem wrapped in the heaviness that comes after repeated attention. You rinse a brush and notice the water turning first milky, then faintly gold. The swirl in the bucket is pretty in a small way, though it is only used water-carrying clay dust and sugar trace. Many working lives are full of such unnoticed prettiness, colors in dirty water, light on tool handles, steam against a cold pane, and the smooth, worn place on a bench where people have sat for years. The claying room does not ask you to call these things beautiful. It simply places them before you until, over time, your mind becomes gentle enough to receive them. A younger person may see only mess and repetition, but repetition has a way of polishing perception, and what was once ordinary becomes not extraordinary but quietly sufficient. There is a comfort in sufficiency. The pail need not be elegant if it carries well, the brush need not be new if it cleanly lifts the dust, and the clay need not look fine if it performs its slow office. The job teaches preference for what serves, and this preference can bring a person to rest more surely than the restless search for novelty. As the evening begins to gather again, the rows show the day's progress in subtle differences. Some fresh clay beds still shine, some have dulled, some are beginning to crack at the thinnest places, and some exposed sugar surfaces wait under cloth for the next morning. The room has become a map of stages, and you cross it like someone walking familiar lanes in fading light. You check the lower vessels one by one. The darker syrup that has collected there smells rich, almost smoky, and it moves with a slow thickness when you shift the container. You wipe the lip clean after pouring or moving it, because a sticky rim gathers dust, and dust in a sugar house has a talent for finding exactly where it is least wanted. A clerk passes the doorway, pausing just long enough to ask whether the batch near the window can be counted for the coming delivery. You answer carefully, saying it may be ready if the night dries kindly, though you do not promise what clay and weather have not yet granted. The clerk nods, perhaps wishing for firmer certainty, but materials are not clerks, and the loaf's readiness is not improved by entering it too early into a plan. This is one of the quiet tensions inside any refinery, the tension between commerce wanting dates and substances needing time. Orders, carts, ships, shops and accounts all prefer the future to be tidy, while sugar, clay, dampness and drying keep a more conditional language. The clayer stands close to that condition, and because he does, he learns to speak with care about what is ready and what is nearly ready. Nearly is a large word in a working room. A loaf nearly ready may still need one more night, a clay bed nearly dry may still tear if lifted, and a mixture nearly smooth may still hold grit enough to spoil its purpose. To an impatient ear, nearly sounds like delay, but to a skilled worker, it is often the honest place where good work is protected from being rushed into trouble. So, you leave the uncertain row alone. You set a cloth lightly over the molds that need protection, shift a vessel beneath a point where the drip has strengthened, and smooth a fresh layer that settled unevenly near the wall. Each act is modest, but together they shape the night, giving the hours after your departure the best chance of doing their slow work cleanly. The lamp is lit earlier now, because clouds have gathered over the city and the windows have gone dim before the shift is done. Its flame brings out the yellow in the earthenware and turns the wet clay slightly warm in appearance, though your fingers know it remains cool. Shadows deepen behind the racks, and the room becomes more enclosed, more like a chamber made for listening to small sounds. In that lamplight, you can imagine the many clays who have worked before you in similar rooms, in other cities, and other years, bending over the same cone-shaped molds and trusting the same pale earth. Their clothes, wages, languages, and refineries may differ, but the gesture is kin to yours. The slow ladling of clay over sugar, the waiting, the lifting away of stained dryness. Such continuity is not often named, yet it surrounds a worker like a quiet inheritance. The inheritance is practical rather than ceremonial. It lives in how a tub is stirred, how a mold is read, how a tool is placed to dry, and how a young worker is corrected without unnecessary sharpness. It lives in the way a person learns that the most useful movements are often the least dramatic, and that a good day may end with the room looking only slightly more orderly than it began. You clean your hands again, though the water cannot remove every trace. Clay remains faintly at the creases, sugar tightens the skin, and the nails show a pale rim that belongs to the trade. These marks will fade overnight, perhaps, but they will return tomorrow, because the work writes itself lightly on the body and renews the writing each day. The last task is to look and then to trust. You look along the rows, along the floor, into the vessels, across the tub covers, and toward the places where tools should be. Then you trust the clay to dry, the water to move, the syrup to fall, the air to pass gently, and the sugar to continue becoming itself in the dark. Outside, rain has begun, not hard, but enough to gloss the stones and soften the sounds of wheels. The refinery door closes behind you with a familiar weight, and the evening smells of wet rope, coal smoke, river mud, and the distant cooking of suppers behind windows. You walk into that damp air with the day's rhythm still moving inside your shoulders, and behind you the claying room settles, pale and patient, into another night of work without hands. By the time you reach home, the rain has settled into the seams of your coat, and the smell of the refinery has softened beneath the smell of wet wool. The street lamps shine through the damp air with blurred edges, and the stones underfoot seem darker than they did in the afternoon, as if the city itself has been rinsed for the night. You do not need to think about the molds with effort, because they remain quietly in you, pale circles under clay, hidden cones holding their shape while the rain falls on Danzig roofs. Inside, the room where you sleep may be small, with a stove giving off a modest warmth and a table worn by ordinary meals. Your hands, even after washing, still feel faintly tightened by sugar, and when you flex the fingers, the skin pulls a little at the knuckles. There is bread on the table, perhaps soup kept warm, and the plain smell of cabbage, rye, or potatoes feels like a kind of rest after the thick sweetness of the working day. You eat without needing to speak much. The household may ask whether the day passed well, and you answer in the simple manner of someone whose work is difficult to describe without making it either too dull or too elaborate. You might say the clay was good, or that the damp slowed one row, or that a batch near the window may be ready tomorrow, and those who know your life will understand enough. Later, when the room grows quieter and the city beyond the walls loosens into night, the work returns in small, harmless images. You see the clay ribbon falling from the paddle, the cracked surface lifting from the sugar, the dark syrup turning in a vessel, and the high window graying before dawn. These images do not trouble sleep, because they belong to repetition rather than alarm, and repetition, when softened by fatigue, can become almost like a lullaby made from the day's own materials. The next morning may arrive under a low sky, with rain still caught in gutters and the river breathing mist into the streets. You walk back through air that smells of wet stone and smoke, passing shutters, carts, and doorways where other workers are beginning their own ordinary rounds. By the time the refinery comes into view, its windows are pale against the darker wall, and the building seems already awake, though much of its work has been continuing through the night. Inside, the claying room receives you with its familiar mixture of dampness, mineral coolness, and the deep, sweet smell that sits in the boards. The clay layers left under yesterday's lamplight have dried slowly because of the rain, and their cracks are softer, less open, more reluctant to separate from the sugar beneath. You remove your coat, Set it where it will not drip on the tools, and begin the inspection with the quiet seriousness that a wet morning deserves. One row can wait. Another row is ready enough. A third needs testing at the edge, where the clay has dulled but not hardened fully, and where a careless lift would pull damp sugar upward in a ragged patch. You press lightly with the tip of the tool, feel the resistance, and leave it alone, because the good worker knows that the hand can serve the process by withdrawing from it. The ready row gives you slower work than usual, because the spent clay bends rather than flakes, and the pieces must be coaxed away. They come up with a soft sound, neither dry nor wet, and the brown stain beneath them has spread evenly enough to satisfy the eye. The sugar surface below is paler, though still damp, and the whole row seems to have advanced during the night in that quiet, rain-tempered way that asks for patience rather than correction. You scrape the lifted clay into a vessel and brush the tops clean, moving from mold to mold with a pace adjusted to the morning. The brush does not sweep briskly. It touches, clears, and pauses, allowing the loosened dust to fall where it should. Your body follows the weather without protest, and the room, wet with the memory of rain, seems to ask everyone inside it to work a little more softly. The fresh clay must be mixed with care, because damp air changes the behavior of what seemed ready yesterday. You do not add water too quickly, and you do not trust the surface shine alone, since a wet day can make the paste look looser than it feels beneath the paddle. The tub answers slowly, and as you stir, the clay folds over itself with a muffled heaviness that belongs to mornings when the city has not yet dried. A younger hand might complain that the weather makes the work troublesome, but you have learned that troublesome is only one of the room's many dialects. Dry air, damp air, cold air, and summer heat each speak differently through clay and sugar, and the clayer's task is not to wish them into sameness, but to hear what they require. Today they require slower lifting, lighter brushing, and a little more faith in the hours still to come. As the morning opens, other sounds gather in the refinery, yet the rain keeps them subdued. The boiling room sends out its warmth in faint breaths when the door opens, and from below comes the sound of a vessel being set down, then shifted, then set down again. The whole building seems wrapped in a grey cloth, not asleep, not idle, but softened at the edges by weather and early light. You lay fresh clay over the row that has been cleaned, and the pale paste spreads more willingly than it would on a dry afternoon. It slides toward the rim in a slow, even sheet, and your tool guides it into a surface smooth enough to hold water where it must linger. The molds receive it without hurry, each one becoming again a small round field of wet earth under which the sugar waits. There is a strange satisfaction in covering what you have just uncovered. The sugar appears, proves its progress, and then disappears beneath another layer, as if the work continually offers evidence and then asks you to trust again. This rhythm of revelation and concealment is part of the clayer's day, and it may be one reason the room feels quieter than many other places in the refinery. Not everything worth doing can be watched from beginning to end. Some tasks require the worker to set conditions, step away, and return later with enough humility to see what happened without him. The clay teaches this each day, because once it is laid properly, your hand can no longer push the water downward, or command the syrup to leave the crystals faster. You can only prepare, observe, correct, and wait. These are plain words, but they contain most of the trade and perhaps a good portion of any life lived close to materials. Prepare what can be prepared, observe what is actually present, correct what correction can reach, and wait without spoiling the thing by asking it to become finished before it is ready. By midday the rain has lightened, and the windows brighten just enough to show the fine dust on the ledge. A man opens the upper pane for a short while, letting in air that smells of wet rope, stone, and the river, and the sweet smell of the refinery shifts around it without disappearing. The damp breeze touches the fresh clay and cools your sleeves. Then the window is drawn in again before the room loses too much of its own balance. Your meal is taken with damp boots near the bench, and the talk turns to the river level, as it often does in a city that listens to water. Someone says the quays were slick at dawn, someone mentions a cart delayed near a warehouse, and someone else says little, busy with bread and a strip of salted fish. The words drift, not needing to become a story, while the loaves sit behind you in rows, as steady as patient animals. After the meal, the afternoon brings a clearer light, and the wet clay from the morning begins to dull in patches. This is when the eye must watch carefully, because uneven dulling may show where the layer is too thick, where a crack is beginning, or where water has found a path too quickly downward. You do not interfere at once, but you notice, and the noticing itself becomes a small mark in memory. Memory is one of the clayer's quiet tools. It holds the row that dried too slowly, the mold with the chipped rim, the batch that came from a darker boiling, and the corner where air moves differently when the yard door is open. No one sees this tool hanging on the wall, and no one washes it at day's end. But without it, the visible tools would not know where to go. The office ledger may say that a batch was filled on a certain day, perhaps with a weight and expected grade written beside it. Your memory says that the weather was wet, the clay needed less water than usual, the third row from the wall drained more slowly, and the boy nearly overfilled the pail before you stopped him. Both records are true, though only one can be sent to a merchant. A refinery depends on both kinds of truth. It needs numbers, weights, dates, and agreements, because trade cannot move on impressions alone. It also needs the felt truth of the workroom, the knowledge that enters through the palm, the eye, the nose, and the shoulder, because sugar does not become reliable merely by being described reliably on paper. In the afternoon, you help turn out a group of loaves that have completed their claying. The molds are brought from a rack where they have stood through several rounds, each one holding a cone now firm enough to meet the air. This moment always carries a small expectancy, not excitement, exactly, but the attention one gives to the unveiling of work hidden for many days. The first mold is handled with a cloth, shifted, warmed slightly, and persuaded until the loaf releases. The cone comes free, pale, and solid, with a faint roughness where its crystals have pressed against the earthenware wall. You look at the surface, at the point, at the evenness of color, and the result is good enough that the room seems to ease by a very small degree. The loaf is set among others, and there is no applause. There is only the continuation of work, another mold, another cloth, another careful loosening, another pale cone standing where a hidden mass had been. Yet within that lack of ceremony there is a durable satisfaction, because the worker does not always need praise when the material itself shows that care has passed through it. Some cones are whiter near the base and warmer in tone near the point, depending on how the syrup has moved and how the loaf has drained. Some require trimming, some require more drying, and some are set aside for a lesser grade without blame. The refinery is not a place where every outcome is equal, but it is a place where many outcomes can still be useful, and usefulness has its own calm dignity. When a loaf cracks, the room becomes quieter for a moment, though no one cries out. A crack is regrettable, especially after days of work, but it is also one of the known possibilities that comes with handling a hardening mass of crystals. The cracked loaf may be broken down, used differently, or entered under another account, and the process absorbs the loss with practical sobriety. You notice the crack, learn what can be learned, and return to the molds. Perhaps the sugar was moved too soon. Perhaps the drying was uneven. Perhaps the pressure came at the wrong angle. Or perhaps the fault began invisibly long before this moment. Work teaches that not every flaw has a simple source, and that careful people must sometimes accept uncertainty without surrendering care. The day passes, and the room changes by increments too small to separate. Clay dulls, syrup gathers, light moves, tools become dirty and are cleaned. Voices rise and settle, and the rows that seemed endless in morning become fewer in need by evening. Your back aches again, but not sharply, and your hands know the nearness of the shift's end before any bell confirms it. Toward evening, the air outside clears after rain, and a faint brightness appears under the clouds. It enters the claying room with a silver tone, resting on wet clay, dry clay, sugar dust, and the dark line of syrup along the trough. The whole room seems briefly washed, not clean in a polished sense, but rinsed by light, as though the day has forgiven its own dampness. You rinse the tools in water that turns cloudy around your hands. The paddle is heavier when wet, and the brush must be squeezed gently so its bristles keep their shape. You set each thing aside in its accustomed place, and the act feels less like ending than preparing the next beginning, because tomorrow's first hour is shaped by what the evening hand remembers. The boy carries a pail away more carefully than he did in the morning. He has learned something from the spill that nearly happened, and perhaps from the way no one made a drama of it. Watching him, you think briefly that most trades are handed onward, not through grand instruction but through corrected movements, repeated mornings, and the desire not to disappoint the material. Before leaving, you make the final circuit. The row near the window is covered, the damp corner is left to wait, the vessels below are emptied enough for the night, and the fresh clay is protected from dust. Your eyes move slowly over the room, and though another person might see only stillness, you can tell which surfaces are active, which are resting, and which will ask for your hand at dawn. The refinery does not belong to you, but this last look has the feeling of guardianship. For the length of the shift, the rows have been under your attention, and now you leave them to the dark with their conditions arranged as well as you can arrange them. The clayer's authority is limited, but inside that limit it is real, and there is peace in fulfilling a limited duty well. Outside, the rain has stopped, and the city smells newly opened. Water drips from eaves into narrow channels, wheels leave dark arcs on the stones, and the river lies broad and dim beyond the warehouses. The evening air is cooler than the room you have left, and as you walk, the sweetness in your clothes meets the clean wetness of the street, until both become part of the same fading day. Another week might bring frost. The windows would whiten at the corners, the tubs would feel colder beneath the hand, and the men would stamp their boots more firmly on entering the refinery. Clay on such mornings has a solemn weight, and the first stirring seems almost to wake it from a deep sleep held in the cold. In frost, water must be managed carefully, not merely because it chills the hands, but because cold changes how materials yield, settle, and dry. The sugar loaves hold the night in their bodies, and the clay placed over them does not begin its work with the easy softness of milder weather. You learn to give such mornings more time, to warm what can be warmed, and to trust slow beginnings more than hurried remedies. The breath of workers shows briefly near the windows, vanishing as they move deeper into the room. Wool sleeves, rough coats, and caps appear until the labor warms the body enough for some layers to be set aside. Even then, the fingertips remain sensitive to the cold water in the clay, and the first half of the shift carries a stiffness that gradually yields to motion. On those mornings, the smell of coal smoke is stronger, because stoves and furnaces work harder in every part of the city. The sweetness of the refinery mingles with that smoke until the air seems darker in the nose, warmer in memory than in fact. You stand over the tub, stirring the pale clay while the outside world is rimmed with ice, and the contrast between cold earth and hidden sweetness feels particularly clear. The sugar itself is less fragrant in cold weather, or perhaps the nose is less open to it. Its smell rises more gently, held close to the molds, while the wet mineral scent of clay becomes more noticeable. A clayer who works across seasons comes to know not one sugar house, but many versions of the same room, each made by weather, light, and the state of the batch. Winter also changes the city sounds that reach the walls. Wheels on frozen ruts strike more sharply, footsteps are quicker, and doors close with more decision against the air. Yet inside the claying room, the work resists sharpness, because the clay still asks to be smooth, the sugar still asks to be red, and the day still passes best when the hand refuses haste. At midday in winter, food has a deeper comfort. Soup brought in a covered vessel, bread kept wrapped from the cold, or a boiled potato eaten with salt can feel almost generous after hours of damp clay. Men sit closer to warmth when they can, and steam from cups or bowls rises briefly, making a soft veil between faces and the rough room around them. The talk may be less lively then, because cold keeps people inward. Someone mentions frozen water at a pump, someone speaks of a child coughing at night, and someone else listens while rubbing his hands together before returning to the rows. The sugar house is not separate from such ordinary human concerns. It merely gives them a place to rest between tasks. In spring, the room changes again. Light comes earlier, and the windows begin to show morning before the first row is inspected. The air from the river loses some of its bite, and the clay, though still cool, no longer seems to resist the paddle with winter's heaviness. There may be mud in the streets, fresh smells from markets, and a sense that the city has loosened its shoulders after months of cold. Spring moisture can be troublesome, but it is a gentler trouble than frost. The clay stays workable, the sugar may require longer drying, and the room often smells brighter, as though the damp boards have given up their older winter scent. You open a window briefly when the day allows, and the air that enters carries river, horse, wet earth, and the faint green smell of things beginning beyond the warehouses. The work remains the same, which is part of its consolation. Seasons pass through it, but do not overturn it, and the clay continues to stir, apply, lift, brush, smooth, inspect, and leave. A person may grow older inside such repetition almost without noticing, until one day the boy watching the tub has become a man and another boy stands beside him. Age enters the trade quietly. The wrist may stiffen, the back may object sooner, and the eyes may need a closer lean to read the faint difference between cream and pale amber. Yet experience often compensates for what youth loses, because the older hand wastes few emotions, and the older eye knows where to look first. You may have known men who worked too fast when young, and then grew into slowness, as into a better coat. Not laziness, not delay, but the deep slowness that comes from understanding the material well enough not to fight it. Such men can finish a row with less visible effort than a younger worker spends beginning one, because they do not ask their bodies to perform what judgment can spare. In the summer heat, even that judgment is tested. The claying room grows close, and sweetness thickens in the air until it feels almost like another layer of clothing. Flies are discouraged where they can be, cloths are kept over what should be covered, and water becomes both relief and responsibility, cooling hands while threatening to make surfaces too damp if used carelessly. The clay dries faster at the edges in summer, especially when a window is opened for air. A layer that looked even when laid may begin to pull away near the rim before its work below has fully completed. And the clayer must notice these small betrayals of heat. Sweat gathers at the neck and under the cap, but the hand still needs to move gently, because discomfort in the worker cannot be allowed to become roughness in the work. Summer light reveals everything. It pours across the racks, catches the sugar crystals, brightens the clay dust, and makes the syrup below glow dark red-brown where it might look nearly black in winter. The room may be less restful to the body then, but it is rich to the eye, full of surfaces that answer light in different ways. On hot afternoons, plain water tastes better than almost anything. A worker drinks, wipes his mouth, and returns to the rows with the modest gratitude that comes from small reliefs in a long day. The sugar smell may become tiring, and yet, after stepping outside into the harsher odors of street, stable, and river mud, the refinery's sweetness can almost seem welcoming again. Autumn brings another mood, perhaps the one most suited to claying. The air cools without freezing, the light lowers, and the refinery feels settled after summer's heaviness. Goods move through the city with harvest behind them, warehouses fill and empty, and the sugar house works within a broader season of storage, preparation, and trade. On autumn mornings, fog sometimes presses against the windows so closely that the world outside disappears. The claying room then becomes complete unto itself, with no visible street, no roofline, no river hint, only the rows, the tools, the pale tubs, and the dim lamp still needed after dawn. In such weather, every sound seems nearer, and the drip below the molds becomes almost companionable. You move through that fog-softened room with steady steps. The clay is neither too cold nor too quick to dry, and the sugar often seems agreeable, as though the season has lent the room its own patience. If work can be said to have a favorite weather, perhaps this is close to it. The mild, damp morning when materials neither resist nor flee the hand. Still, no season is perfect, and no batch is entirely without its own request. A clayer does not expect perfection from the room, any more than a sailor expects the river to have only one mood. He expects change, and because he expects it, he is less troubled when change arrives wearing the ordinary clothes of dampness, heat, cold, or delay. The days gather into months, and months into years, each one leaving little deposits in the memory. A particularly stubborn batch a winter of severe cold, a summer when the clay dried too fast, a boy who learned quickly, a tool that broke at a foolish moment, a row of loaves that came out beautifully pale after everyone had doubted it. These are the stories of the claying room, not often told as stories, but held in the shared knowledge of those who worked there. A person outside might ask what happened in such a life, meaning what great event, what turning point, what dramatic change. The honest answer might be that many mornings happened, many rows were tended, many loaves were whitened, and many evenings ended with tools put where they belonged. That answer may seem small, but most of human usefulness has always been built from small continuities that allowed others to live, eat, trade, write, cook, and rest. The sugar clayer's life is one of those continuities. He does not stand at the center of history, but he stands near the center of a process that brought sweetness into ordinary and ceremonial use. His hands help transform sticky, darker sugar into a pale, solid cone that can travel, store, sell, and dissolve into tea, preserves, cakes, medicines, and household comforts. Every lump broken from a loaf carries, invisibly, the slow work of claying. No one shaving sugar into a cup needs to think of wet earth spread over molds in a Danzig refinery, and perhaps that is proper, because finished things often protect people from the labor behind them. Yet, for a sleepy mind wandering backwards into old workrooms, there is a gentle pleasure in restoring those hidden hands to the scene. You can imagine the cup, the spoon, the small piece of loaf sugar dissolving in warmth, but then you return to the claying room before the sugar was delicate. You return to the tub, the pail, the earthen mold, the stained underside of spent clay, and the patient worker deciding whether one more layer is needed. This return does not make sweetness less sweet. It makes it fuller, grounded in hands, weather, and time. By another evening, the room is ready again for night. The season may be winter, spring, summer, or autumn, but the closing gestures remain familiar, because every day must be left in a state that respects the next. Tools are rinsed, surfaces covered, vessels checked, rows remembered, and the door closed not as an ending, but as a pause in work that continues without voices. The lamps burn low in the passage. The claying room behind them is dim, pale-topped, and still, with its rows of hidden sugar quietly surrendering their darkness. Outside, Danzig settles by degrees, and the river carries its own slow traffic under the evening sky. While inside the refinery, the clay rests on the loaves like a soft, earthbound moonlight, drawing the sweetness clearer through the long, patient night.